Hi, I'm Ron and welcome to PopScicle, where I talk about popular culture, science, and everything in between. In case you're new to this channel, I'm Ron. I'm a biologist and a biology teacher, but I'm also immersed in popular culture, and that's what I talk about in this YouTube channel. I haven't recorded a video in a long time, actually. It's not because I didn't have anything to say about anything. In fact, there were so many things that I wanted to talk about, but I was really busy with schoolwork as a teacher and administration work and all of that. But I'm glad to finally be able to bring out an episode, and this particular episode is going to be about science. In particular, it's going to be about a journal article that I and a colleague of mine published in the Philippine Science Letters journal in volume 14. And it's about wildlife trade, particularly about consolidating data from various organizations. And these institutions are in particular the CITES, or the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which is the international body that regulates legal trade in organisms, in animals and plants. And we also have the Department of Environment and Natural Resources Biodiversity Management Bureau, which is the local government agency in charge of wildlife and biodiversity conservation. And finally, the Palawan Council for Sustainable Development, which is in charge of that, but particularly in the province of Palawan. So what I did was to consolidate the existing data from all of these three institutions. CITES provided data from 1975 to 2018, so it's a very rich source of data. Whereas DENR-BMB and PCSD provided data from the 2000s, 2008 specifically, all the way to 2019. So it's much more recent. So there are just a few years that are overlapping among these three, but it's still very useful information for us to be able to tell how much pressure there is on organisms being traded. First of all, let me talk a bit about wildlife trade. It is essentially the international trade in animals, plants, and derivatives from them, like horns, antlers, other internal organs, etc. Anything that's derived from these organisms. And this is for a lot of various needs, like pharmaceutical needs, construction, science, experiments. The pet trade is definitely one. Clothing and the like. Food also, of course. So this is a very big industry. In the Philippines alone, it's probably worth 50 billion pesos. That's around $1 billion US. And it's so big that the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime has declared it as being just as important and just as critical to solve it as other forms of trafficking, particularly trafficking in people, drugs, and weapons. So that's how big it has become. And I'm sure you'd be able to appreciate that the more we extract animals and plants from the wild, where they are supposed to be, there's going to be a lot more pressure on these wild populations, and thus that usually leads to a decline in these wild populations, which would lead to an overall loss of biodiversity and an overall loss in a lot of the functions that we get from ecosystems, a lot of the things that regulate life on our planet. So it's very problematic. And then, of course, given the situation that we are in now, the pandemic that we are in now, it's even more important to think about how much we are encroaching on natural environments. Think about the fact, or think about what has been determined through research, that we got COVID-19 from wildlife consumption, particularly of bats in China. So that tells us that the more interface or interactions we have with wildlife, the greater the chances of zoonotic diseases spreading. And we wouldn't want another pandemic, right? So governments worldwide and academic institutions and conservationists are really calling for a significant control and curbing of wildlife trade and consumption. And this paper touches on that. So just a few findings. It's a pretty long paper, and I'm providing the link to the full paper down below in case you'd want to read it. But Just some highlights. With regard to CITES data from 1975 to 2018, we have over 14,000 export records, meaning records of exports from the Philippines to other places, and this is with regard to animal trade in particular. What's most striking and disturbing from this data is that out of these over 14,000 records of exported animals from the Philippines, over 21% are extracted from the wild. So that is direct pressure on wild populations. The three groups of animals that are most heavily extracted from the wild are, perhaps unsurprisingly, reptiles, but also bivalves, which includes giant clams, and that's the particular group of animals that's being traded significantly, and also anthozoans, which is the group that includes corals and sea anemones. So when we talk about anthozoan trade, we're talking in particular about hard corals, which of course are very, very popular in the aquarium trade. So all of these three groups, but actually all of the animal taxa, including birds, are heavily exploited and extracted from the wild, and that's really problematic. Now, the primary difference between the data from CITES and the data from the local government agencies is that the latter present illegal trade. Ones from CITES are largely legal except for confiscations, and the three aforementioned groups of animals are also the most often confiscated according to CITES. The DENR-BMB and PCSD data show you illegal trade because these are really all confiscations and seizures from airports, seaports, and markets, and all sorts of places that sell illegal wildlife. And what's really striking about this is that reptiles are the most heavily traded, along with birds. In fact, in terms of legal trade per CITES, birds are actually the most traded as a group. Although surprisingly, or perhaps not if you've been reading on similar literature, it's the long-tailed macaque, a monkey, a primate, or Macaca fascicularis that is actually the most traded of all animals, or most exported of all animals from the Philippines. So there is a need to look at what's going on with their wild population. Now, like I said, it's reptiles and birds that really are the most heavily exploited and heavily traded illegally. And it's pretty, if you've ever gone to a place like Cartimar, which is historically known to be a hotbed for illegal wildlife trade, then you'd often see these exotic mammals and birds being sold at very high prices. But these high prices really haven't stopped a lot of people from buying them and then possibly reselling them also. Sellers get a lot of money, which is actually one of the reasons why deterrents like fines and from being caught are not really significant deterrents, because these fines are very, very small. There have been traders who have earned millions of pesos from selling wildlife, but when they get caught, they get fined, what, around 50,000 pesos, less than 100,000 pesos. So it's not really a major deterrent for them, and doesn't really convince them or scare them to stop trading. And so that's one of the major problems. Now, bringing together these databases, it tells us that there are particular groups that are quite problematic because they've had a long history of trade, but also they are endemic, meaning they're only found in the Philippines, and they are extracted from the wild, as well as, according to the IUCN, or the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List data, they also have small or declining population. This figure shows you the intersections of the three databases. Some groups of animals are exclusive to particular databases. Others are in the intersections of two out of the three. Then in the middle are those families of animals that are reported in all databases and so are probably the most critical. And then you have this list of the animal species which are endemic to the Philippines, have small and declining populations, and don't have as much protection as they should be given. So we probably have to reassess their status, particularly in the National Red List. And this would be very important because a documentation like the Philippine Red List would be very useful in justifying the inclusion of certain species in the appendices of CITES. When they meet during their conference of parties, they decide on what organisms, what species to include in their appendices, which means that they would be protected by law internationally. And not, as you may imagine, only very few species are actually included there. A lot of threatened species are actually not included there. So it would be good for us to reassess the listings, both at the national and international level, for the sake of campaigning certain species that are problematic for greater protection. In the Philippines, wildlife trade has been going on for a very, very long time. If you look at primary historical texts, you will see that even prior to the Spanish colonial period, meaning prior to the 1500s, we have been trading with our neighbors, particularly China and other Asian neighbors, on wildlife. And some of these animals that we have been actively trading since then have been corals, birds, mammals, clams, and turtles also. But also sea cucumbers, which might surprise you. Sea cucumbers have actually been a very, very prominent traded animal good, particularly with China, because it figures in traditional Chinese medicine, which is one primary driver of the wildlife trade with China. So this should give us pause and should make us realize that there's so much pressure on wild populations. And in terms of what we can do as people, well, the number one is actually to make ourselves aware, to read up on these issues. Hopefully the article that I have, which again I link to below, will be helpful. But also, of course, please don't buy from illegal wildlife markets. The problematic thing is sometimes you may end up buying something that's supposed to be legal, something that's supposed to have a permit for selling, particularly if you buy something online. And yes, you can buy animals on social platforms like Facebook, but very often, or more often than we'd like, what's supposed to have permits doesn't actually have permits, and so it's illegal. But definitely those places like Cartimar and Arranque, which we know sell wildlife illegally, should not be supported. It would actually be safest if we don't buy exotic animals at all. We just stick to domesticated animals, to pets, because we really don't know the source. We can't ever be completely sure if they're captive bred, which is the more favorable alternative, or if they're wild caught. It's a very complex problem and there's no one solution. In fact, part of the reason why I'm still doing research on this is because I want to find, or I want to propose certain solutions. But definitely educating ourselves on the value of wildlife and on their status in the wild and how much impact human activities have had on them are very important. And also, of course, advocating for no longer buying exotic animals. The question of a complete ban on wildlife trade is debatable. There are a lot of issues about it because, for example, if you say that there's going to be a total ban on wildlife trade, that will probably just drive the desire for wildlife, because the more illegal it is, the more exciting for some people it is, the more of a status symbol it will be if someone gets these animals, and it won't really stop the black market from selling wildlife. Whereas if it's not completely banned, then there will be some form of a regulation by the government. So it's really very complex. Maybe we'll have time for discussing that in another episode. But for now, I hope that was a useful, informative episode in terms of maybe introducing you to the whole concept of wildlife trade. But if you've heard about it, then hopefully this gave you a lot of extra information, particularly on wildlife being traded in the Philippines. Again, I invite you to read the article that I've linked to below. If you like that episode and you would like to hear more on science and also popular culture, don't forget to subscribe to PopScicle so that you may be alerted to new content in the future. Bye!